Greetings, BookTube. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I am joined, as always, by my special guest, The Highway, but it is not actually the greatest disruption in my life, and probably not the greatest disruption in your life right now. In the backdrop of this video, which I have tried to record before, speaking for 50 minutes before realizing that I had not actually clicked the play button, or if I had clicked the play button, had clicked the stop button after, is the deeper, anxious weight of our new political reality. And in some ways I'm thankful that I didn't post the piece I had last week. I think it was a stunning piece, and until I realized it hadn't recorded, I thought to myself, gee, this might actually be one of the best things I've done. But I wanted to talk last week about, obviously, the issue that you're seeing if you are able to see the YouTube screen, Asimov Science Fiction, September, October, but in a broader context. What happens after really painful world events like the one that we just witnessed with the U.S. election varies from person to person, obviously. Some people were shocked. A lot of us were not shocked so much as receiving a confirmation of a terrible, ugly reality that we had quietly hoped would have changed by now, but also had a feeling would never change in time. For all of us, there's now the question of what happens next. And it's different a little bit for every context. Some people have thought, oh, that's very kind of you to care about what's going on in the U.S. But as a Canadian in Colombia, as a global citizen, I know full well that that election had devastating consequences, not just for U.S. citizens, not just for people who live in the U.S. in general, but for the world. So when I saw that election result, I saw a significant end to any meaningful collective effort to mitigate climate change, to try to ready us to adapt to climate change that is already here, that is already finding the world changing in dangerous ways for many people. I saw the end to responsible foreign policy, such as it might not have existed in the first place, but truly a lot of the world orders that we were hoping we could still patch together, band-aid, heal from a lot of recent transgressions, was just taken from us in one fell swoop. It's going to be an extremely ugly reality for a lot of people. It already is an ugly reality for many. On top of that, we have been dealing with rising nationalism, rising tribalism in general, people being led by fear and anger into a level of intense territorialism that's not going to get any better as the world changes under climate change. We're going to see more resource wars, more environmental refugeeism, which is going to lead to more cultural clashes and a deeper digging into a sense of this is mine, this belongs to my people, everyone else is a filthy invader who's just trying to take. And that cascade failure is going to make it really hard to be able to lean into the collective practice we need to curb some of the environmental factors that make it so hard for us to rise above our tribalism. So I do not see good times ahead. And I already see that we have a media economy that is devastated in many ways. And I see a lot of folks lacking the media literacy necessary to recognize how much they're being coaxed to respond to everything through fear and anger. And I worry about how we're going to fix that, if we're going to be able to fix that. Possibly the solutions that are going to arise are going to be quite local, and maybe right now that's the best place to start. As I mentioned on my newsletter, we have a few assignments right now, and none of them involve grand changes. Staying alive, staying with us, looking for local need, and finding your gifts, the useful gifts that can answer local need. Really, right now, as a starting point, those are our tasks. in the middle of that, so many of us have really important niche talents and skill sets that we have been pouring into very specific industries because it's tied into our socioeconomic existence. It's also tied into our sense of self, our creative practice. And the added question after this election and its broader impacts on the whole world was how to pursue that creative practice in an ethical manner. So last week when I first tried to record this, I wanted to talk about being mindful of the whole human in everything we do, which means we're not going to turn away from any of these niche communities. We're going to make sure that everything we do in all the spaces where we have created pathways and communities of care, we are feeling comfortable with the amount of energy we're putting into certain tasks, and we feel always that what we are doing has some value. If it doesn't, if it feels like it's a distraction from the work of being our whole human selves in this world, that's a concern, and it's something that we need to look at. I've already talked with my fellow volunteers in one space. I was the co-editor of the SFF blog. We strive to support professional and professionalizing writers by elevating their commentary, their thoughts, and that's a space where we can absolutely continue to create safe community. So we're trying very hard to make sure we minimize anything around that might get in the way of just being able to focus on how to uplift and how to extend the platform. But it's difficult because we as individuals have to focus on our own livelihoods, and so it's easy for tempests and teapots to creep in. All kinds of industry drama always shows up to make things a little bit harder. And it's not to say that there aren't going to be crises along the way and problems that we need to solve within any of our industries. It's just that we need to be holistic in our thinking. As much as possible, we have to make sure that everything we're doing and every crisis we take on actually serves to affirm us in our overall goals, in our overall ethics and attitudes toward one another. There is a lot of pain in the world right now, and there's going to be a lot more pain in the years to come. So everything I do, I want to make sure is done more conscientiously, more carefully, and with more respect for how little time and how little energy any of us have for the immensity of what's to come. With that said, I do feel there is a place, a really important place for speculative fiction, and I'm really thankful to be going back to Asimov's today, again, the September-October issue, because Asimov's is one of our pillar publications. It's been around through so much. This publication has been through so many terrible periods in political history. And so there is something lovely about being reminded and allowing oneself to be reminded that some things will carry on, some spaces will carry on. When you sit with a publication like this, what you're really sitting with is an opportunity to connect yourself with a struggle that has gone on decades and generations before you, and hopefully will be able to go forward for decades and generations more. You are part of a longer conversation. So that's why we're going to pop into this one, starting as I always do with, well, actually, sometimes I do start in the other direction, don't I? But today I'm going to start with the nonfiction first, and then move on to the short stories. I'm not going to talk about the poetry again, so apologies there. It's another medium, and I should do more context building around that, so one day. But I really feel as we go through this issue that you're going to see some of the reminders within the work we do of what can be done through science fiction still to create a platform and to create a sense of community for one another in difficult times, and hopefully even to inspire as well as to comfort. The issues nonfiction begins with Sheila Williams' editorial. So Sheila Williams is reflecting this time on 2022 World Science Fiction Convention. And one might think, well, that was a couple of years ago. Isn't that a little bit out of date? But I actually think it's quite nice to go back a little bit instead of immediately reporting on an event, to reflect on the larger impact, what you have truly remembered, what were your real takeaways. There is something, of course, to be said about reporting in the moment, but just because an event has a year attached to it doesn't mean that it ceases to become relevant once that year has passed. This one involved a guest of honor who died before the event, Earl Korshak, art collector, SF publisher, and a couple years on, Williams sits with the collection and her experience in retrospect, and that means that we, in turn, get to be reminded that the work of memorializing a person goes on past these famous events, and hopefully the legacy of the person will go on past these specific moments too. So in terms of keeping our history with us and going forward, Williams' editorials are always quite lovely for doing that work, and just again gently reminding us that we belong to a longer continuum than we sometimes think when we're caught up in really painful aspects of the present. When it comes to excellent reflection of the past, Robert Silverberg has us covered next, and he talks about one really special sci-fi writer that you might not have heard of, but that's just part of the arbitrary way in which these things work. So although there were many golden era writers who became household names, Will F. Jenkins might not have been one of them. And this is especially fascinating because he was exceptional in his record for anticipating new inventions and ideas about how the world works before they actually came to pass. So we have from him in A Logic Named Joe, a story from 1946, a modern internet-connected computer. When it comes to generating electricity in space, he imagines the technology to do that in The Power Planet from 1931. In 1945, we get a 3D printer, which he calls a constructor, and it designs with plastic materials in a story called Things Pass By. He also had a pseudonym, Murray Leinster, and in 1920 and 1921, that pseudonym was used for work in which he imagined a world that is changed dramatically because of carbon dioxide emissions, and it's become a steamy, tropical environment in a far future. In that case, it's not humans that are responsible for it, but nonetheless, it's that mechanism is well known that carbon dioxide emissions could drastically transform our climate. Now, Silverberg is a very wise writer himself, so he doesn't create a sort of Nostradamus figure out of Jenkins. He's highlighting that it's a really interesting record, that he did get quite a bit right. And so he celebrates Jenkins in this regard as a writer who was more often on the anticipating correctly the future than many others of his age, even though we don't know his name as well as we do others. So history is fickle, and it is also filled with many people come before us who were able to dream big and to imagine things to come in a way that actually did come to pass. Then we move on, again, another history piece to really tie us into the sense that, again, we're not new to most of this. We have two pieces, actually, that are really quite good in terms of binding us to the past next. James Patrick Kelly's on the net. The Music of the Future is the name of this piece, and it reflects on the soundtrack for 2001 Space Odyssey. And it talks about the theremin, it talks about the first electronic soundtrack, it talks about iconic scores in A Clockwork Orange and Blade Runner and Twilight Zone. But more importantly, it's asking this bigger question about what does the music of the future sound like? What should it sound like? Is it something that should have more classical elements? Should it have the eeriness of digital tech? And what I really loved about this piece is that it left me frustrated. I say I love that because as I was reading it, I kept waiting for him to move into other things that he could have said or written about music, because there's so much. Many theses could be written about this subject. And I felt excited after reading this essay because there was so much else that I immediately thought of in relation to the theme of music and science fiction and how it draws history into the present, into the future. So Again, a lovely piece that just creates a sense of continuity, which we try to capture in our writing about the future, which everyone knows science fiction is really about the present. It's one of those lovely works that just reminds you are part of a longer story and a longer conversation. This notion of continuity comes through extremely well in the next piece, Kelly Lagor's thought experiment, Nuclear War, Satire, and the Grotesque in Dr. Strangelove, which is the first in a four-parter on the genre masterpieces of Stanley Kubrick. It's an excellently written essay. It has wonderful structure, case study for anybody who wants to improve in their own essay form. It starts by reflecting on terms that will be used for the rest of the piece, satire, the grotesque. It moves through real Cold War history and then looks at genre histories of response before situating Kubrick's piece within that history of response. It even follows up that history of the film itself by looking at a novelization by Peter George, which is a fairly interesting and unfortunate case as well, because George died by suicide in 1966, and there's an intimation in this piece that that quality of response or feeling carried by the author might have something to do with the extremely grim, serious tone in the book itself compared to the film, which of course we all know was deeply irreverent. And Strangelove was Kubrick's only comedy, and yet the comedy emerges from the fact that the horror is off-screen. A lot of the other times, the sense of awe, the sense of something greater than ourselves that needs to be seen as such, is present in the work because it's an amplification of what exists in the world. But during the Cold War, we already were at 11, so to speak. We were already amplified to a sense of existential dread that required a contrapuntal beat. And the narrative structures that emerged, able to respond to the Cold War with this kind of humor, were necessary as a cry of humanity amid a really bleak moment. When we read about Cold War history and the fiction that was written during those times, we should be somewhat fortified today. It's not that we should look at the past and say, oh, because the Cold War was survived in general by the species, it's okay, we can survive this too. Not all people survived that period. Peter George certainly didn't survive that period. And today a lot of people are going to suffer too. But now as then, there is space for work that is going to be able to sit with us and reaffirm our humanity in the middle of the tremendous amount of work that's going to go into survival. And that's something that you can get from reading your history and from connecting again with all the writers who've come before us. They too had their cultural anxieties. They too were responding to a profound body of cruelty and incompetence in their own day and age. So I really truly appreciated all of these elements in the nonfiction section. We're not finished with the nonfiction though. I mentioned that Asimov's has been around for a long time. Sheila Williams is a wonderful, steady hand. I do, however, remember reading the archives. When I was younger, I had copies of my grandfather's subscription and then my father's subscription. And boy howdy, the era in which Asimov was in charge had a bit of a different tone, and a little bit more combative, a little bit more quarrelsome, and a little bit more critical. And sometimes it's good to see that elements of that also continue today. So we have Norman Spinrad next. In Citizens of the Galaxy, he reflects on 3 books that he read recently discussing this theme. He has this wonderful meditation before he gets into the works themselves, in which he is reflecting on how much has changed in our understanding of the cosmos, and yet one pressing issue remains. The idea of when we are finally going to know that we are not alone, whether from first contact with a higher sentient extraterrestrial life form or from life that we create on Earth. That seems to be that anxiety point. When are we truly going to meet the other? As Spinrad argues, any entity that is capable of gravitas has a soul. And when he goes through his reviews of the 3 books, he's looking at that broader question of consciousness on a galactic level. So it's a tall order. The first piece that he discusses is David Brin's existence, and he kind of eviscerates it in a way that if anybody who knows Spinrad, this is not new. Spinrad will be very blunt if he's impatient with the trend or just doesn't find a book to be up to snuff. In this case, I'm going to quote, because I actually found this quite a bit of a chuckle, not for Brin. You have a lot of empathy for the author being eviscerated, but just listening to the intensity, the passion of this discourse, I think is something to keep in mind. Quote, "Over and over again, there were many dramatic places in which the reader was about to be satisfied only to be left hanging over a cliff. I've read some of Brin's novels, and I don't remember him ever using this cheap trick. Worse still is that this almost 956-page novel should have been cut to no more than, say, 600 pages by getting rid of the endlessly boring pieces of non-existent blather written by non-existent gurus, along with pages and pages of the records of speeches by various characters dead as doornails in literary or drama terms. How could this happen to a novelist as experienced as David Brin? Who was his editor on this novel? Or was there an editor at all? Did Brin have the foolish economic power to insist that there not be one? How can a publisher allow such a thing? Are you kidding? Just follow the money. Or better still, make it so." So, I had a chuckle when reading this progressively more enraged, incensed bit of outrage. How could this have happened? Because, again, a lot of things happen in our world. A lot of terrible things happen. And yet there's this fascinating scale that we end up operating on, because within our professional practice we have our small outrages. How could such a book exist? How could an editor not have intervened? What kind of economic madness allowed this to happen? This is one of those tempests in teapots. And yet there is something about the passion and the care for the genre as a whole. As he sees it, he has one perspective, we all have our own, that comes through in work like this. And I think to myself that even things that we can sometimes see as petty or small can still be doing the work, as long as we are being careful about how we're framing everything. What is the bigger purpose of our energy spent on criticizing, on calling attention to things that just don't seem to fit one sense of how work should be done? Is there room for criticism in a time like this? Yes, so long as that criticism is something that speaks to elements bigger than the text itself. In this case, again, the blame wasn't put all on Brin. It's not saying Brin, you're a lousy author. No, I've read this work before. This is a cheap trick. There should have been structures in place to keep it from happening. Talking about a broader community or broader system of work that needs to be done instead of just picking on an individual. He then moves on to Each This World by Julie E. Cerneda, which is a work that he considers to be selectively rigorous around the science. He is, however, really quite pleased by this work because even though certain aspects don't quite meet his standard of hard science fiction, he's quite impressed by the human-alien relationships. As Spinrad writes, "Hard science fiction, this is not even rubber science fiction. Call it fantasy and science fiction clothing. However, I don't think I've ever read anything this realistic, sophisticated, and complex about the biology, relationships, cultures, wars, misunderstandings, and politics of very different citizens of the galaxy. This is far from rubber science where Cerneda wants to make it feel realistic. These aliens may look and even smell like hideous monsters, may even act as what we might consider as evil, but they come off as real beings." This piece by Spinrad does have a lot of cantankerous moments, but it is framed around a lot of constructive discourse at the same time, and that's a good mode to be working within. I should say also, I love a good negative review, and I say that as somebody who has received them themselves, because it's part of the process of being read. Once you put your work out into the universe, everyone's going to read it in light of their own expectations and their own preferences. There is, however, a range of ways that one can go about providing criticism. And so again, the aim always, if this is work we're going to do in the world we have, we should be making it constructive. We should be thinking about broader systems that cause the problems in the first place and offering some sort of template or solution for how to do better next time. Which brings us to the fiction in this issue. Again, this is a spooky issue, so there are more stories here that have slightly fantastical elements, but we start with a science fiction story with a hard problem. It is no nonsense, and you don't have to agree with the solution that is presented. The idea is it is presenting an ethical problem, and it's looking at the problem from a few different angles. You don't get to sit really with the solution. The solution is withheld from you until the final moment, but the whole dilemma has been presented in a way that allows you to make choices for yourself from all the options presented. And that's a wonderful kind of science fiction writing. So Nick Wolven's Heartshock is a story told from the point of view of a captain of a fleet that has just won the day finally in a battle against a brutal enemy. The people of Lovalis have been a nightmare for the system. They have terrorized other worlds, they have slaughtered other peoples, and so the coalition of resistance members has been fighting to win the day. They finally have. This ship is now about to take the home world. And the captain now has to consider, how are they going to take the home world? Are they going to destroy it the same way that the people of Lovalis have destroyed so many others? Are they going to cause immense suffering for everyone on Lovalis? Many people in the coalition and the resistance do want that ending, but the captain is a little bit hesitant about becoming the evil that they have just tried to defeat in battle. And then to complicate things, a little tiny pod makes its way out to meet them, and its occupant is a member sort of the upper class on Lovalis who wants to plead for the ship to, yes, please, punish Lovalis because it deserves to be punished. She describes a number of people who were trying to resist, who maybe didn't do anything or enough to bring down the government, but they certainly didn't agree with the government. They were horrified with it. They wanted to bring it down. They just didn't quite find the right moment. They were making plans, but nothing followed through. As the person says in the middle of this very odd petition, which you get the feeling is a petition to try to save her own life, quote, "Every citizen of Lovalis is a sinner. Not every one of us, however, is a sadist." And so, unquote. So she's trying to identify, yes, we saw these things happen. It was horrible, and we just didn't do enough. But there were some of us who definitely weren't trying to do all the horrible things. We just couldn't stop our leaders from doing it. So our planet absolutely deserves justice now. The captain has to find a solution that will work for their own sense of conscience, appease the rest of her alliance, and take into account the commentary of this interesting added component. The solution that emerges might not work for everyone. It is, however, a solution that offers a lot of room for discussion, which is what good science fiction should do. So Heartshock is an excellent story to use as a framework for ethical problems, and I hope it will be taken up as such by many readers, because you might definitely come to different conclusions about the ending. That's not the point. The point is a story like this is written in such a way that it compels you to think about these kinds of ethical dilemmas too. The next piece, coming after a very deep, intense story of intergalactic genocide, a much smaller, more delicate, more a gentle piece, but no less deeply human. So Alice Towey's Art Deco farmhouse, original hardwood floors, slightly haunted, finds Evan grieving a relationship. He has just moved into this space with his boyfriend, who then broke up with him, and then he discovers, there's a poltergeist in this space, and he thinks that the poltergeist is the previous owner. Elizabeth is the niece of that person, and she visits the house because she wants to check in on its new owner and connect a little bit. She has her own memories of her uncle, very fond. And when she realizes that the poltergeist might be her uncle, she also really would love to be able to connect with him. This story is on the other side of the spectrum for science fiction and fantasy because Mike may or may not actually be there. We're not ever sure. We don't ever get full confirmation about this. But it's a beautiful story about two grieving people and the ways in which they can build community for themselves in the wake of a loss. So the first two stories in this issue immediately establish quite a range. This is then fleshed out with the next piece, Naomi Kritzer's The Four Sisters Overlooking the Sea. And I'm going to spoil a little tiny bit, but my goodness, it should not actually be that much of a spoiler. There are signs all along the way. I'm not going to spoil the full ending, but I am going to say that this is a Selkie story. And Selkie lore right now is very popular. A lot of people are writing Selkie stories. Not a lot of them are selling because sometimes it can oversaturate the market, but this one is a beautiful addition to the lore. It involves a woman and her child trying to settle into life in this lovely coastal town where she's learning a lot about the local culture, which has its own version of Selkie lore. Meanwhile, the myth is tied in beautifully to the wife herself. She has an academic husband who has her work on all his papers and help write and produce all of the fantastic work that he's known for without getting credit. And she herself is a seal researcher, but her career was cut short by the loss of all of her data at a very important point in her development. And she sort of accepted the loss and poured herself into serving her husband in his academic work. And as the story goes along, everyone, of course, quickly realizes that this is the kind of trap that this woman has made in line with the kinds of traps that are set for Selkies in folklore. So this beautiful interweaving. I'm not going to spoil anything about what happens in the end, but there's just such a patience to the way this story is told. It's not about the spoilers. It's about recognizing the rhythm of a familiar trope and being able to sit with the fact that it's familiar for a reason, because the reasons that the Selkie lore existed years ago in other cultural contexts have not fully gone away. There are still a lot of people in many positions trapped by similar circumstances. So this is one of those stories that reminds you folklore exists and folklore persists because it still speaks to something very true in every generation, a sense of loss, a sense of struggle. Again, as I mentioned, this issue is a really good one to sit with in this time because even though it's sort of supposed to be spooky, it ends up sometimes highlighting the fact that all of the difficult problems we're facing now have been faced before to some extent in different ways by people who also felt like their world was closing in on them and struggling for a way to better times. That said, the next story, we have to have some kind of devil story in an issue for Halloween, right? So Stephanie Feldman's Bachelorette on the Devil's Dance Floor is another delight of a reminder that these kinds of stories about demonic possession and behavior exist because human beings can be awful to one another. And sometimes, like some people have good bachelorette parties, and other times they're just drama. And here we have a lot of drama. We have Angie as the bride, Bea as the envious sister, and Elle as the envious friend. And they're supposed to be having this one last grand tour on a remote location. The idea was that they were going to take part in a cultural tradition common to the area around the wedding grounds, but instead they meet Christian, the sneaky devil guide, who takes them off to a more authentic ritual that they can be a part of. And each of them, because they're so consumed by their own arrogance and issues, especially Bea and Elle, the story doesn't really need to have the demonic component, but the demonic component just amplifies what exists already in these human beings. So it's playful, it's fun, and again, a good reminder that our stories exist, and our stories have always existed to try to give voice to aspects of ourselves that we know plague our ability to be better to one another as much as we want to. This leads into a ghost story. It's a beautiful ghost story, very delicate, light touch, but patient. So Zohar Jacobs' An Unplanned Hold follows the ghost of a Jewish engineer who'd worked with the space program in the United States for his life and got to see sort of the end of the first phase, that first burst of space travel, of reaching for the stars. and then finds himself hanging around, just waiting, life going on around him without the space program, without a return to space, and he gets to see all of the faltering missteps without a clear sense of why he's still there. Now, the story has this really generous ending as to why he's still there, but it's more this beautiful meditation on the fact that we live through these moments which often feel like they are the start of something, and they can be cut short. And then who knows if they will ever start again. We do so much within our moment, not knowing what the next moment is going to hold. Also tying into this sense of history, again, rich backdrop to a lot of the stories in Asimov's, Anita Vijayakumar has bitter chai, sweet chai. A lovely, rich, nuanced story that has a fairly simple premise. So Sanvi's family has long used the secret ginger plant to test the worthiness of marriage matches. It only works for the women in the family, but if they put this ginger into the tea and they have the other person, when they're with someone that they think that they might possibly have a relationship to, the taste of the tea will tell them if it's right or not. But that worked for many generations at a time also when women didn't have as much control over their matches. So there's a sense of struggle, it being an embodiment of struggle through many more limited eras. But now the world's a bigger place, and Sanvi's no longer living in the same context. Also, the ginger plant that her family used is disappearing because of some connection. There's climate change, urbanization, a whole slew of factors that tie into the changing world. So the old bonds that made this plant necessary are starting to unravel. There's also the sense of marriage used to be the big story of escape for a woman, and now maybe there are different stories. Now, this story could have gone in a very different direction with the approach it takes to One Key Conversation, because on a flight back home, Sanvi is seated on a plane next to a Ukrainian woman who's going home to fight. But it's not a simplistic, she's had no luck with all of the men that she's tried this tea with because she's actually, she's actually meant to be with a woman. The two of them have different stories than the ones that they may be expected to be inhabiting. This Ukrainian woman is going back to fight. She didn't expect that she was going to have to do this. And Sanvi's world has grown too. So the world is changing, and this story becomes this beautiful meditation on how the stories, the traditions that we carry with us, while so much of our folklore has a reason to persist, there's also this moment where we have to reflect on whether some traditions are going to be carried forward in the same way in the world ahead. So again, simple premise, but really understated and nuanced in a way that might linger with you. The next one is James Patrick Kelly again. He's got a story, In the Dark. This one is a look at future relationships. Z is waiting for his ex-girlfriend at a very elaborate new form of film-going experience, much more immersive. But she doesn't show up, so this poor calendar model of a firefighter instead catches the attention of a group named Tosha. And when I say group, this is a new set of terminology for ways that individuals exist together. The group named Tosha is made up of different connected individuals, including one member, Shah, who wants to hook up with him, but they've got a shared mental framework that is part of the future element of the story. And most of the story is about this, just essentially himbo, this lovely, lovable firefighter, a little bit sad because his ex-girlfriend isn't going to get back with him, learning, and through him we get to learn too, about a different way that a new collective of human beings might arrange themselves or see themselves, and how pretty much at the end of the day it doesn't change the fact that we're all just looking for connection and maybe a little bit of love and maybe just a little bit of fun. So the more things change, the more some things really do stay the same. Robert R. Chase, Lost Recall is next. This one is a clever story because I think we're all exhausted with how much race science exists in our discourse and a lot of really awful uses of genetics. Chase has provided us here with a story that plays with those concepts to create something actually clever, innovative, and fun. This looks at what all of today's advances in paleontology, genetics, group identity, and race science might actually lead to, in the way of discovering that there might have been a secret group of human beings among us all along that, for a good reason, until fairly recently, managed to escape our notice. So it is a clever story about an alt-race that exists within our time that plays on a lot of the science that is usually leveraged to much uglier ends in our discourse. So I really like the way that Chase uses that science to good advantage here, makes it playful, and makes it quite generous in terms of learning more about ourselves in the way that this technology is supposed to be used to elevate and advance our understanding of our broader humanity. So that was a lovely, wise little technical piece too. R.P. Sand has an aching piece. Oh my goodness. There's a lot of pain in this piece because you know where it's going, and there's a lot of wisdom in it too. Eternity is moments. This is a beautiful story about a grandfather whose favor turns from the oldest grandchild to an enterprising younger grandchild who spends a lifetime stealing him away from the rest of his family, pretty much just to secure access to his fortune, while our protagonist becomes an engineer who dedicates her life to rebuilding the ecosystem. And so she's doing a lot of really important work, but the gradual loss of her grandfather's attention is a pain for her as well. The thing is, it's also not a unidirectional loss. While she is grieving the lost connection with her grandfather and trying to pour herself into her work, in part because maybe she thinks her work will reconnect her to him, she almost misses sight of the fact that she's starting to do the same to her own family and neglecting the home and the people she's built around herself. She catches herself before it's too late to learn from his mistake, and this story is very generous because it has a different cosmology in imagining an ending where the grandfather and the granddaughter get to be reunited and heal and start over. But more importantly, it is about the idea of where we put our attention. There's so much hurt, there's so much loss in this world, and we can very easily, unwittingly replicate it in our own practice if we're not careful. So a lovely little piece there. Oh, the next one, Betsy Aoki's And To Their Shining Places Go, is I think it's the most ambitious piece in this collection. A richly imagined world in which we have the Alarial, an alien species with many factions that all share sort of hive insect behaviors, have taken over the Earth. They didn't kill everyone, though, because they decided that we were more useful as part of science experiments. So as long as we're useful for their science experiments, we get to still live. And thankfully, their science experiments involve virtual reality simulations, so we're not all being fed to the slaughter. But it's still a very tense world. They have a research facility where Mayumi has been very fortunate to get in as a worker, so she's so excited she's going to be able to work within the game development center itself. There, though, working directly under the Alarial, she is brought in to witness the death of a traitor, a human traitor, which is horrifying. This brings her into a chewier range of Alarial politics, because this hive species has its own robotic species that it doesn't consider to be sentient, but they are sentient in a different way. And she really comes to understand how, even though they claim to be scientific, there is a lot of prejudice built into their politics amongst themselves. So she ends up having to navigate this group of the robot helpers and the different factions while trying to carve out a space for humanity to survive in the end. She does get a chance to do something that will protect her species, but it is a clever workaround that comes from a really well-imagined world. Definitely a better designed concept than many I've seen when it comes to alien species for some time. So well worth sitting with this one and thinking through some of the overlaps between commentary made here and a few real-world elements that I think definitely have resonance points, but highly innovative in a seasoned subgenre. So well done, Aoki. Susan Schwartz has the next piece, Project Fafnir. Now, on the SFF blog, we have been doing a series recently on alt history, so I'm very fresh right now, and in my mind, a lot of discourses around alt history and the question of why. When is it useful? Why do we try to retell stories from famous moments in the past? This was one of those stories being all history itself that raised that question as I was reading it. Why are we retelling this story? Why are we adding something to the story? And I think there's a good reason for it, but it's not in the text itself. You have to know something else outside of the text to really understand why the choices have been made here. It's rich and nuanced, but it has another layer if you know your history. So, the story Project Fafnir reimagines a key moment from World War II during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, during a few days when troops trapped at Bastogne were awaiting the relief of General George Patton's Third Army. So in this interim, we get a battle with a secret German weapon, a real dragon. And there's a lot of intense, rich discourse that is well done in terms of capturing the moment. But the bigger question comes out of this is that we have this horrific scene, this battle that is so devastating in real life, and it's being expanded upon in this one tiny section, one tiny location. Why? I think it comes down to Patton's character, because at the end of the story, Patton does show up. He's not in the main story, but there's no Patton's going to arrive. Patton's going to arrive. Patton was an anti-Semite. It's not the only one. There are a lot of hateful people in the United States Army who fought against the Nazis, and we have this very terrible, flattening effect of history where we pretend that fascism really was only on one side and that there weren't people in the United States who also were quite sympathetic to the cause, and many others who were just hateful, racist, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic. And so we have this famous figure, and really important. He was the one who helped lead an extremely important movement in the war, and yet he was known even at his time as somebody who was not favorable to the Jewish people. This is why I think the story has this level of power, is that we do focus on Jewish members of the Allied forces. So through Schwartz's story, we get to focus on people who are fighting the good fight at the same time that they had to be careful if they were captured to make sure that their dog tags were missing, because their dog tags would have marked them as Jewish citizens and they would have ended up in more horrific treatment. Patton has his moment in history books, but in stories like this, we get to recenter the struggle around a lot of the lesser-known people who were multiply victimized, not just by the enemy, but also by people at home. And this is true as well. We have stories in relation to black soldiers going overseas and sometimes finding far better treatment overseas in Europe than they had ever experienced at home or would experience among their own soldiers. So a story like this pushes back in these very gentle ways. Again, there are elements in the story that highlight the Jewish character of the people that we're following, but you have to know the bigger element in history to realize why it is important to center or recenter some of this discourse around these great hagiographic moments in World War II around some of the people who went to war without as much prejudice as those around them. Next, we have Ray Naylor's A Grey Magic. Now, Ray Naylor is always just an absolutely fantastic read. I was happy to get a chance to read another of his works. This one is not as dramatic in its premise as many of his other pieces. It's a very gentle piece, but I do think it, like every one of his pieces, responds to an aspect of the moment that we're living in a very honest and sensitive way. So this piece is about a worker who's dying. She's lived a very hard life in a structured system that really doesn't leave much room for people to have joy, to have been able to do much except work to stay alive. She's coming to an end. She knows she only has a few months left, and part of the care package she receives is a chatbot that encourages Jenna to have experiences while she's still here, as small as they might be. And so there's a beautiful lesson in this piece, understated, about the fact that we might not have much agency, but any agency we have at all to be able to use our time alive to its fullest is not wasted. So sensitive and wise. Our last piece today is Robert Reed's All the Homes of Terror. And I remember when I read this issue, I took a beat before I leapt into this one because it was listed as one of his great ship stories. And he is an extremely wise, distinct storyteller. I don't think there's a science fiction writer quite like him in operation today, because he comes to his grand space operas, his grand space fictions, as if he is writing classic mythology in some ways. He has this expansive sense of time that imagines the reader not in the present. You'll find a lot of stories will try to cater the future to us. I mean, again, all science fiction is about the present. But his stories truly try to imagine a deeper time scale. They're trying to imagine a reader who themselves can operate on cosmic time instead of the finite moments in which we live. And so this story spans a few different time scales and moments within a consciousness that is part machine in terms of operating with a specific consciousness that moves through many different generations, many different generations of life aboard an ever-changing vessel that supports many other lives in a universe that is itself a kind of vessel or machine. So he's got these scales that he's working with in his stories, and it sounds abstract when I'm saying it, and it can feel abstract when you're reading it. It just moves between the time scales of thinking about memory for the universe, memory for the great ship, memory for the individuals upon it, with a sense of matter-of-fact absurdity and at the same time essentialness to every quirk of culture for every distinct generation. So there'll be offhand remarks that would make sense within that generation and maybe never again, or descriptions of a certain custom for a species that will make sense in that moment and never again. So he's working on a different time scale, and reading his work is, as a result, not really about trying to get a bigger sense of the plot. There is movement in the work, but it's more with sitting with a very different kind of perspective. And again, that's why it was so lovely to sit with this issue of Asimov's, although it's always lovely to sit with an issue of Asimov's, at a time like this, when it's filled with so much work that is mindful of our history, that tries to remind us that many of our folklore traditions, our tropes, exist because we've undergone the same kinds of problems as human beings for a very long time. At a time like this, when it can feel very heavy to live in the world, when we know that there's so much work we need to do, and that there's so much we need to do to make sure that our practice as writers is aligned with our general practice as human beings. So there are so many wise, thoughtful, challenging pieces in Asimov's September, October. I hope that some of this description will have inspired you to go out and read a couple of them yourself. But if not, that's okay. We don't always have the time or the resources. More than anything, in these last couple of weeks, I've been thinking deeply about how I can try to make sure that everything I do furthers certain aims and advocates for certain ways of moving through the world. I think there are most certainly ways in which science fiction can be a part of that better dreaming and of creating a level of compassion and resilience for the times ahead, but it has to be done carefully and conscientiously. So whatever you're reading, whatever you're writing, whatever you're contributing to as a volunteer or in your paid professional labor or elsewhere in your life as a human being, I hope that you'll take the time in the next while to ask yourself if the energy that you're pouring into things is energy that you're proud of. Do you feel that you are serving a body of principles that will carry you and your communities forward? And if not, if you find yourself weighed down, why am I doing this? Why am I getting caught up in so many tempests and teapots? Are there so many exhausting diversions from what I care about most? This is the time, hopefully, if you have the resources to do so, to really think about what you can do for yourself to nurture the whole human and to find a better balance between everything you do going forward for the many years in which we need you here doing that work. So, as always, like and subscribe if you enjoyed any of this, but more importantly, support the work you love. Go out and find people and communities and publications that you love and try to let them know that you are thankful for the space that they are creating and give them the means to continue to create more. Thank you so much for your time. Have yourselves a day.